It's inherited from the mother. Unfortunately, that leads to all sorts of, inappropriate relations between masters and slaves, and then people enslaving their own children that they conceived with their female slaves, which is just utterly awful in so many ways, right? So it's matrilineally inheritable, which just sounds like a really, really fancy word for meaning it comes from your mother, and it is lifelong. So there's a lot of conflict as well. So this would be things like, well, let me give you a whole bunch of examples. These are just too many examples. We don't need to know all of these. I would know a couple examples of this. Pueblo Revolt or Pope's Rebellion. That's his statue right there in the National Statuary Hall in the Capitol building. That's Pope. And he helps to lead the Pueblo Revolt. Be aware of things like the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. That would be in Virginia. You got King Philip's War, the Pequot War up in New England. They all have those. And then there's a whole bunch of King William's, Queen Anne's, and King George's War, the War of Jenkins' Ear, all those weird ones. Just be aware that the Native Americans are fighting against the Europeans, but also the Europeans are fighting each other. And this is going to be important. The Native Americans view the Europeans as simply another tribe to play off against each other. And the Europeans are going to do the same thing, play the Native American tribes off against each other. So be aware that there's going to be plenty of conflict. There's going to be plenty of trade. Those are both forms of interaction. Native Americans, again, have autonomy. They also have agency. They have the ability to negotiate. They are not being completely dominated at this point. Please don't say Europeans were able to do whatever they wanted and Native Americans couldn't respond ever. Native Americans could respond. They had trade goods Europeans wanted, and vice versa. They had military power over the Europeans, depending on where they were. Think of the difference between Dutch interactions in Albany versus Dutch interactions in New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam is farther south. It's way closer to the port. It is a port, and there are way more Europeans. Therefore, they treated the Native Americans worse. Albany, they're surrounded by Native Americans. They need them for the fur trade, and there aren't as many Europeans. Therefore, they treat them better. So there's a little bit of a, well, to use the famous phrase from the 1970s, right? There's realpolitik. Wow, that was a fail by the closed caption there. Realpolitik. Looks like realpolitik. And the idea there being, hey, there we go. We got it finally. Nice job, Google transcription. And the idea there being, we're going to play off against each other. We're going to do, not necessarily based on principles, but based on what helps us the most gain some strategic or power advantage. So, there you go. All right, it is important. We need a quick stretch and hydration break. Because we are here and we are buckled in for 5 hours. We don't want to be here just sitting on our butts the whole time. We need to take a quick break.
No, you know what? That's good comms. That's good comms.
Drink. You want to go lift some weights?
3 minutes?
Squats,
Yo, I can't do that for 3 minutes.
Make sure that you are ready to go. So we're going to take a brief 3-minute break. Here we are.
All right, I took a brief 3-second break, so I think that's good enough.
So how good does it feel to save on your commercial auto insurance with Geico?
As good as having a great hammer.
Can't touch this. Save the copyright right there. Let's go, BB. All right. He's coming back in 2 seconds. Oh, I actually didn't play the video. There we go. The video is actually over and he has not returned.
All right, well, we are back after a brief stretch and hydration break. Hopefully you are all feeling great and you're ready to dive into period 3. Here we go. All right, our posture is good. We've done some stretching.
My posture is horrible right now.
Water to refresh ourselves. And here we go. We're back. So, period 3. 1754 to 1800. One of my favorite periods, not the least of which because it involves Hamilton. Hey, we got some rapping going on. All right. And 1754, we're talking the 7 Years' War until 1800. 1800. The Revolution of 1800. But why is it revolutionary? That's not helpful. Wait, isn't... Oh. That's like the Midnight Judges and Thomas Jefferson gets elected. Okay, so now I have my bookends. 7 Years' War, a.k.a. Road to the Revolution. 1800, a.k.a. the end of the very
Start
early
of
Federalist
Jeffersonian
administrations right after the Revolution. So, we're going to be talking about, as you're not surprised, the Revolutionary War, before, during, and after. The new government, including the Constitution, the ratification process, and then also kind of this ambiguous idea of migration and trade that happens, aka treaties and Native Americans and stuff like that we can be familiar with. Alright, so, let's dive in. First of all, the 7 Years' War. We should be familiar with the 7 Years' War because we just talked about it at the end of last unit, and maybe we should dive into that a bit more, though. I did just mention briefly, that this is when the French get kicked out and the British begin to take over a little bit more. So this is also known as the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War. Either one is fine. 7 Years' War gives us a bit more of a global perspective, so that's what I would prefer to use, just because it's not just fought here, and also it's confusing to label it as just your enemies. It's like calling World War II the Nazi-Japanese War. That makes it seem like the Nazis and the Japanese were fighting each other, right? The French and the Indians are not fighting each other. The Indians, largely, with a couple exceptions, think the Iroquois, are on the side of the French. So, just be aware of that. Some quick iced tea, because evidently I need more hydration and extra breaks. It's like I'm talking all the time or something. Ridiculous. Alright, so, this is an example of an imperial rivalry that's happening on the North American continent. Native Americans are going to be caught in the middle, and they are going to be on both sides of the conflict, but largely on the side of the French, because the French treat them better. The French need them for the fur trade. The French are less interested in stealing their land, whereas the Native Americans recognize the English are more apt to steal their land, so they side mostly with the French. What you have to know, though, afterwards is that land and debt play a really big role. First of all, New France, the area in blue on that map, is totally gone. So the English take over because of the Treaty of Paris, because this is when the 7 Years' War ends and they kick out the French. And then you need to know that this costs a lot of money, right? William Pitt does not fight this for free, and they end up having to spend a lot of money to kick out the Native Americans, kick out the French, and so, well, it only makes sense that the grateful British North American colonies would pay some extra taxes to be able to pay for this war that saved their behinds. Oh, wait, this is going to be a problem. So, you might be recognizing the road to the revolution here. And then 1763, a very important date, and you might want to know this acronym, PEEP, which I got from Adam Norris. I really like that acronym here. It is the proclamation line of 1763, aka the line that kind of outlines the red there that says, look, American settlers, you can't move any further because you're just going to antagonize the Native Americans we just finished fighting. Please stay on this side of the line. The British North American colonists say, to heck with that, I want this land. And then they keep going. E, end of the 7 Years' War. Makes sense, Treaty of Paris. E, end of salutary neglect. Remember we talked about that, healthy ignoring. The British are not going to want to enforce the Navigation Acts until it becomes lucrative enough or necessary enough, or they have enough troops to enforce it, and they do after the 7 Years' War. And then lastly, P, Pontiac's Rebellion. Pontiac, Chief Pontiac, is a Native American chieftain who recognizes that once the French are gone, they no longer have a source of weapons and supplies to fight the land-hungry English, and so he launches a last-ditch effort to try to push the English back, but while he still has guns and ammunition from the French, it is not ultimately successful, but it shows you a sign of things to come, right? So then diving a bit further into this idea of the end of salutary neglect, there are taxes and tea that we need to talk about. First of all, stamp tax, the Stamp Act. This is talking about these kinds of stamps, aka I paid a tax on this piece of paper, not I have to like stamp everything or I'm paying for stamps like you put on postage stamps. We're talking a stamp that says I paid for this piece of paper. So a lot of paper is going around and all of it needs to pay a tax, and it's just 1 penny. But the thing is that adds up over time, and the colonists don't like that. The Stamp Act in 1765 is the first direct tax on British North American colonists. They paid indirect taxes before, but this is a direct tax. They do not like this. This is thus marks the end of salutary neglect. This is going to cause all sorts of backlash, right? Think smuggling, protests, boycotts. Women are going to lead a lot of this. Women are going to lead a lot of the boycotts, saying we don't need British goods, let's make our own. There are going to be a lot of smuggling that goes on. Let's trade with the Dutch. Let's trade with the French. Anybody but the British, because they're the ones that are making us pay extra duties. And this is when we start to get things like Common Sense getting published.
Thomas Paine.
Common Sense gets published in 1775 by Thomas Paine, the original T-Paine. Oh, yeah. And he's going to argue that America should not be ruled by the British because it doesn't make sense for an island to rule over an entire continent. So there's all sorts of acts. Now, you could talk about all kinds of acts, right? The Tea Act, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, the Townsend Acts, the Intolerable Acts. We have tons of acts. Know a couple of those, right? Again, don't lose the forest for the trees. The Stamp Act is a rather important one because it's the first direct tax, but some of the other ones are up to you.
Bundle home and auto and you're protected 365, 724.
24/7, 365.
Tomato, tomato.
Have you tried the new
Oh my God, I have
AAA
no place to
Jalapeno
stop
Ranch
at.
Club?
Did you see ranch?
I need a little ranch.
It's only after the Boston Tea Party that we have the intolerable acts or the coercive acts, right? That say that we're going to punish, the British are going to punish Boston until they repay the tea, and that leads to more rebellion. So some are more important than others. You can memorize some of those if you'd like to. Leading some of these charges against the taxes and the tea and the British are going to be the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, aka American rebellious groups. The British would view them as almost terroristic, but they are fighting for American freedom. Swirling in the background is going to be the Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening. The Enlightenment being a European philosophical tradition, and the First Great Awakening being a religious experience that happens starting in England, coming over to the United States, the British North American colonies. And they're both going to create what I like to call the swirling vortex of individualism, aka everywhere in the 1700s in the British North American colonies, there's this idea of individualism. So, for instance, there's the rights of Englishmen, right? The rights of Englishmen have always been a sacred idea to English people and to British colonists, and this is going to involve, I have the right to my property, I have the right to not be put under trial for ridiculous reasons or have an unfair trial. Think back to the Magna Carta. The First Great Awakening is going to say, look, you have the right to make your own decisions about Scripture, so open the Bible, read it, understand it. You don't need some fancy priest who went to Harvard and who has a degree to be able to tell you what to do. Just be able to read the Bible yourself. You're a strong, independent Christian that don't need no priest. And then the Enlightenment says, along with all the rest of that stuff, you're a strong, independent citizen that don't need no king. We have representative government being tried already. Think of the House of Burgesses and the town hall meetings. But then we have people like John Locke and the social contract theory that start to get discussed more and more. Montesquieu, separation of powers. All of these ideas are talking about limiting government, not having the divine right of kings. A small r republicanism begins to be a thing eventually, where people are going to want to, let's say, they're going to want to govern themselves, but they're not going to want to do so in a way that's like, ooh, give me power, right? It's much more about, I'll serve my country, but I'm sort of disinterested, right? That whole idea of I'll serve my country because it's my duty, not because I'm power hungry. So we have options there. And then we should talk about the American Revolution itself. No one is surprised. This makes sense. So the American Revolution. How are we going to talk about all of this stuff? Well, first of all, this is not AP military history. As much as some of us wish it was, right? We don't want to turn this into AP American history. This is all about the causes, some of the effects, certainly the causes and the effects, and a little bit of the what's going on in the middle, but it's mostly about the causes and the effects. Alrighty, so let's dive in and talk more about the American Revolution. Here we go. First of all, keep in mind that there are loyalists. There are not just patriots, right? We don't want to make the mistake of assuming that every American colonist thinks the same. This could add some nuance to an essay later. The idea here being that loyalists, John Adams estimated that loyalists were about a third, patriots were about a third, and a third were just like, I don't care, just don't burn my house down. Maybe accurate, right? There are plenty of Americans who do not like the revolution, who like the British rule, and find these taxes to be completely fine. So that adds some complexity to the picture. On the other side, there are militias and the Continental Army. So how are the Patriots fighting? They have some ad hoc militias. They also have the Continental Army under the control of, here comes the general, Ladies and gentlemen, the pride of Mount Vernon, the moment you've been waiting for and all that, George Washington. His leadership and his direction enabled the Continental Army to avoid losing battles so that way they can eventually win the war by wearing the British down. There are maybe a couple of specific battles that you can be aware of. Think like Saratoga. Saratoga is the one where we begin to have guns and ships from France.
What was the one where
Guns
French?
and ships, and so the balance shifts. After Saratoga, the French go, ooh, time for some 7 Years' War revenge, and the Americans look serious, so let's take their side. There's Yorktown. This is the whole world turned upside down. Cornwallis surrenders, and the British blockade and Washington's troops, and they managed to cause an entire British army to surrender. So that's a really big change. And Yorktown is in 1781. The peace treaty is signed in 1783, so it basically ends the war. There are plenty of women who are involved, right? Think about Mary Hayes, Deborah Sampson, plenty of women who either take their husband's place, they assist, they sneak into the army dressed up as men. There are lots of women who contribute and lots of people who are able to help out. It's not just colonial boycotts, it's also some of the fighting. And then be aware that sort of there's all this idea of freedom swirling around. So first of all, we have abolitionism. If we're talking freedom, 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 what about the enslaved people? I mean,
Say hello to Sara Lee Half Loaves.
Yeah, I don't know when I have a free
Half loaf,
moment.
right fit, realize great size, less waste, all taste, more flavors to savor. First bite.
Hold
right.
on, Timmy
Brand
Turner.
new, all
God.
new, little Sara Lee love.
Oh my God, it's 15 seconds unskippable. Okay, that's when I can
GMC
skip.
Acadia goes big on technology.
I don't
So
really
you-
care. I'm sorry.
some of the founding fathers refer to themselves as being enslaved to Britain, and yet they own slaves. There's some hypocrisy here. Maybe we should talk
George
about
Washington
that and eventually
had
engage
hella
with that
slaves, too.
as founding fathers. Oh yeah, okay. Then you have revolutions. The American Revolution is going to be an example, an inspiration for other revolutions in Haiti, in France, in Latin America. And then lastly, we have ideas about Republican motherhood. Women also want some freedom, but they are told to find their freedom in the home, taking care of children, and raising up good American Republican, small r Republican citizens. So in this case, Republican motherhood doesn't mean like Republican Democrat. It means republic, as in a system of government based on laws and representative government. And the idea there being women are supposed to help their husbands as they go off and do things like vote, and then they're supposed to raise good sons and daughters, and the daughters will help raise good sons and husbands, and thus voters. Speaking of voters and that sort of stuff, we should talk about the Articles of Confederation, the early American governmental document. First made in 1777, eventually ratified, and then they are into effect until 1789 when the Constitution takes over. It's our first governmental system. It is worth knowing how it compares and contrasts with the Constitution. By the way, in case anyone's wondering, mango peach iced tea. Is
Mango. Sorry.
There we go. It is a unicameral governmental system, meaning it only has one branch. It's basically a Congress. It has a weaker central government. There's no taxation directly, and they have to ask the states for money. And in order to change anything or pass anything, they basically have to have unanimity or a supermajority, and so not a lot gets done. But it does accomplish some things. First of all, let's think about this. How does it help? Well, look at the dates. It helps to get the British colonies through the Revolutionary War. They passed the Northwest Ordinance, which is going to abolish slavery.
Whoa.
It's going to establish the right of private property. It's going to establish public education funding in the Great Lakes states. So there are some examples right there, including my very own Michigan, woohoo, made a state in 1837. So the Northwest Territory and the Northwest Ordinance all organized under the Articles of Confederation. That's a good idea. In contrast, now we have to talk about the Constitution itself. Well, one of the reasons the Constitution is deemed necessary by the powers that be, the Founding Fathers, the rich men who are running the country, would be things like Shays' Rebellion and the Annapolis Convention. Shays' Rebellion is a rebellion of a bunch of indebted farmers in northern Massachusetts. They demand that they be paid for their Revolutionary War service and not have their farms repossessed because they're in debt. And they took over some courthouses. They threatened to take over more. Washington maybe has to go put it down. Oh, it kind of dissolves. but it makes the rich people very, very nervous. They need to have stability if they're going to do business, and so they need something that's a bit stronger with its governmental system so they can have stability and thus more business opportunities. The APUSH Convention, again, related to stability and economic issues that rich people want to make sure that they have stability for their investments. They want to talk about easing trade restrictions between the various states, but they don't have enough people to be able to conduct business, so they end up meeting again next year in Philadelphia in 1787. There are various compromises you should know. I mean, you should of course know the basics of U.S. government, right? Like the three branches, the checks and balances, those types of things. But then also be aware of some of the compromises, like having a bicameral legislature, the Great Compromise. The bicameral legislature means there's a House and a Senate. House based on population size, Senate based on everybody gets one equal vote, and thus the small states are happy with the Senate, the big states are happy with the House, and everybody gets to have, some say in the government, and there you go. Unfortunately, there are also things like the Three-Fifths Compromise that end up saying that black enslaved people will count as 3/5 of a person for purposes of taxation and representation. It's a way to get the southern states to stay in the Union, but at the cost of people's lives and dehumanization. Speaking of that, there's also the Fugitive Slave Clause and the slave trade. The Constitution has a Fugitive Slave Clause, aka you have to return people that are held to labor, they don't use the word slave, held to labor in a certain state and brought back to that state, and then they agree not to get rid of the slave trade until at least 20 years later, and that's going to be 1808. Separation of powers, we already talked about. Federalism is a really big deal. It's not just the Congress, it's Congress and the President and the judicial branch. And then federalism refers to the fact that there is a national and state and local branches of government, not branches, sorry, but levels of government. So, a lot of different options there. Well, in order to get this Constitution ratified, of course, they have to go through an entire process, and some people are deeply, deeply skeptical. A reminder that some anti-federalists who don't like this are people like Patrick Henry. You know, Mr. Freedom, give me liberty or give me death. Mr. Freedom himself, he does not go to this convention. He thinks that this might be a grab for more power. He doesn't like governments having too much power. So the ratification debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists is raging, and it is not an easy or simple one. In order to get the Constitution passed, as you can see in this political cartoon here, each state ratifies in turn. Delaware, so-called the first state, because it's the first one to ratify the Constitution. Well, the big fights were these last two right here, Virginia and New York. Without those, the biggest and most important colonies at the time, without their support, the entire Constitution would have been doomed. So in order to make this happen, the Federalists who support the Constitution have to do two things. One, they write the Federalist Papers. Remember Hamilton, Jay, and
when I heard I was approved by one main, I was very relieved.
Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. Sorry, mind blank for a second there. They are going to write a bunch of these papers. Hamilton wrote about 51 of them, so a lot of them, and they write these to support the Constitution. The Bill of Rights is also going to be included later on as a promise and as a way to be able to talk about, hey, Anti-Federalists, I know you're really nervous that the Constitution gives too much power to the federal government, but chill out. We got the Bill of Rights for you, and that'll protect some of your rights and prevent the federal government from infringing on your rights too much. So, those two things are what the Federalists are able to use to ratify the Constitution. And then we need to talk about early Republic migration. So as people are moving west, Native Americans are going to be there, including people like Little Turtle, and they are going to resist. There's going to be various treaties that Americans are going to make as they move west. Think like Jay's Treaty and Pinckney's Treaty. Jay's Treaty being the one that gets, it's kind of like the Revolutionary War Treaty Part 2, where they get the British to leave their forts in the Midwest. Pinckney's Treaty is going to get the U.S. access to New Orleans and the Mississippi River, thanks to the Spanish. There's going to be the Whiskey Rebellion, and remember, that's going to be another thing that happens during the Washington administration, where there are Western farmers versus East Coast establishment types. There's the cotton gin and slavery, aka 1793. Slavery becomes much more popular because the cotton gin makes slavery much more profitable, and thus slavery is going to expand and continue to move west. And then, while we're talking about all this, please don't forget that there are Spanish people in the American Northwest still. Think present-day California, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, etc., including Junipero Serra and the California missions. It was a Spanish monk, and he was creating missions all up and down the California coast. Again, controversial because he is trying to convert people, and he is an early proponent and bringer of imperialism to these areas. So be aware of that. And then we should just talk about the early republic government in general. First of all, we have this gentleman. Oh boy, I don't know.
Who is he?
He looks kind of familiar to me. I feel like I've seen a guy with his likeness before. I don't know.
George
George
Washington.
Washington.
There,
It's on a
yeah,
dollar
yeah,
bill or
yeah,
something like that. On the quarter as well. My goodness. And Washington's administration goes from 1788 to 1797, 1789-ish. And we need to know a couple things about him. First of all, Hamilton and Jefferson in his cabinet, right? This is where we get the cabinet rap battles. If you want to look at those, look on Instagram or something like that. There's been some examples of me rapping some of those. Maybe we can talk about those later if we have some time. But Hamilton, the musical, of course, talks all about this, and so that's a good, fun thing to be talking about. Then we have neutrality, banking, federalism, all of these issues that Hamilton, the Secretary of Treasury, and Jefferson, the Secretary of State, are going to disagree on, even though they're both in Washington's cabinet. Well, these factions are eventually going to lead to the first parties, aka Federalists and Democratic Republicans. And I know what you're thinking. Wait a minute.
George
I thought
Washington, no.
I thought we were talking about
Don't make
Federalists
parties.
and anti-Federalists. What the change? Well, it turns out that Federalists are pro-Constitution, anti-Federalists are anti-Constitution. And then once the Constitution is ratified, there's no longer really a point to have an anti-Federalist party. But the Federalists still stick around, aka they are the pro-Hamilton faction, they are the pro-big government faction, and then the people who are more Democratic Republicans, aka they want more power to the people, they start to flock around the Jefferson idea. So we have some options there for what they want. You can talk about various topics like neutrality during the French Revolution. Hamilton sides with the British, Jefferson sides with the French. Hamilton wants a national bank. Jefferson thinks that's too much power. Hamilton wants more federalism, power to rely on the national government. Jefferson says, now we need more state power. So we have options. And then George Washington's farewell address, remember that? He says, let's stay out of foreign entanglements. Let's stay out of Europe. And we largely pay attention to that for a long time until, World War I and then World War II especially, right? So we'll leave all that aside. That's Washington's administration. Now we need the second president. Oh, yeah, John Adams. John Adams, the first one. And he is from 1797 to 1801. A couple things to know about him, largely all related to foreign policy. First of all, the Quasi-War. This is where we were trying to trade with France and Britain during the French Revolution. And we ended up going kind of to war with France, but not officially, but kind of, because they kept sinking our ships or taking our people hostage when we were trying to trade with the British. The British were impressing our sailors, but, we'll talk about that later with the...
Twix bits are creamy and crunch.
Bro.
Without T-Mobile 5G home internet, this place is spooky.
Yeah, they're gonna just, you're just gonna have to do this for a second.
That's just our T-Mobile home internet delivery.
Now you can get the fastest 5G home internet with same-day delivery, powered by DoorDash.
See? Nothing to be scared of.
Get T-Mobile 5G home internet delivered the same day, powered by DoorDash. Just $35 a month.
Relax. I also got my new phone delivered the same day.
Everything all right? I heard screaming.
War of 1812. John Adams and the Federalists in Congress are going to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts, which make it harder for recent immigrants to vote and make it illegal to criticize the government, which cracks down on free speech, which is unconstitutional, but they pass it anyway, and this is going to be opposed by Jefferson and Madison in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. The only reason I bring this up is because it kind of reminds us of the Sedition and Espionage Acts of World War II. It's a suppression of civil liberties during wartime, which is always a theme in American history, and it brings up the idea of, well, how much speech do we actually have? And then if speech is being violated, who intervenes? Is it the courts? Is it the states? And then speaking of the courts, John Adams is also the guy that appoints John Marshall as a midnight judge at the end of his term. And that's going to lead to the Marbury v. Madison case. But largely this just matters because that means the Supreme Court is headed by a Federalist for the next 40 years. Thus, very, very powerful. Even though the Federalists don't win the presidency after John Adams, they still have the Supreme Court of the United States. And then we should talk about national identity and culture just real briefly. Keep in mind that there are things happening like Noah Webster makes the American English Dictionary and starts to codify that a bit further. Think about all the different spellings, right? The British spell color, C-O-L-O-U-R, and the Americans spell color, C-O-L-O-R. And when the British asked what we were doing, we said, getting rid of you. No, see what I did there, right? They were talking about breaking up with the British, and they ended up having even different spellings. Phyllis Wheatley, a really good example of American poetry. Gilbert Stuart, an American art, like you can see here. We're also going to see things like neoclassicism and American architecture. There's a picture of Monticello and the University of Virginia, like some good examples of neoclassical architecture, aka the Americans are deliberately imitating Greece and Rome. So we have some examples there of Greece and Rome and their kind of architecture. Makes a lot of sense as they want to emulate their democracy and their federalism, or sorry, their republicanism. All right, we got period 4.
What's up, Dad?
How are we doing?
I already boxed it.
We got through the first 3 periods, which means we are.
I got the shirt.
Well, we would be a third of the way done, except that
not
the periods
yours.
are longer.
No.
But we got through 3 periods out of 9. We can do this. We're
I
making
can
it.
check.
It is
and the other
a little
stuff.
past 6 o'clock. We're about an hour in. Quick posture check. Lean back in your chair. Oh, get that upper back crack going. Ooh, feels good. Make sure that we are staying hydrated. Make sure that we're not sitting on our butts for too much. All right, period 4. Here we go. It's 1800 to 1848. I apologize for the typo there. Definitely 1848. Why? Because 1800 is going to be the election of Thomas Jefferson. You know what? That's bothering me. We're just going to fix that right now. Here we go. Live editing, folks. You said it couldn't be done, and yet here we are. Oh, we don't want that. We want this kind. There we go. All right. That makes me just feel so much better. I don't know about you. That was just really bothering me, right? So, 1800, the election of Thomas Jefferson. Partly important because Jefferson's a big deal. Partly important because this is the first peaceful transfer of power between American parties. We have what used to be Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans being overwhelmed by the...
Let me go pee real quick.
Federalists, well, now the Federalists are in charge, and then the 1790s, the Federalists are in charge, I should say, and then by the 1800s, people have kind of soured on the Federalists because of the Alien and Sedition Acts, and then we get Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. Pardon me a second, I'm going to just grab my presenter notes over here so I can kind of see what's coming up with our slides, and then we should be all set to go. We want some full screen, and we want the closed captions, and here we go. All right, we're back into the swing of things. All right, so 1848, that's going to be the Seneca Falls Convention. So looking at our book and dates again, we have the election of Jefferson, a.k.a. more Democratic Republicans in charge. And then we are going to have 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention. It's also the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, But we're not really interested in that as much as we are in the Seneca Falls Convention, because we need to be talking the antebellum reform movements. Yes, I'm glad you thought about that. Well done. Well done. So let's start with the age of Jefferson. So the Revolution of 1800,
How old is
historians
he?
say,
Get it?
not that big of a deal, but like it could have been. At the time, this election was contentious, right? Jefferson and Adams were going toe-to-toe. They were duking it out. They were accusing the other of being just terrible people. And, well, it turns out that Jefferson wins. And once he gets power, all of his big talk about reducing the size of government gets a little bit harder to do. Wonder if we'll ever see that again. And he ends up doing some things that he used to argue against, like the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. We're not sure that's constitutional for the U.S. to just take over land, and yet he does it anyway. He's allegedly a strict constructionist, like the U.S. government can only do what's in the Constitution. But Louisiana Purchase doubles the size of the U.S. He's pragmatic. He's practical. He says, all right, this seems like a good idea. Let's make it happen.
Shopping is hard. Make it easy with Stitch Fix. Get outfits you love without any of the hassle. First, tell us your style, sizes, and budget. Then we get to know exactly what you like and don't. Next, your real human stylist sends pieces that are so you.
Bro, I'm so
You can try it on before you buy it for free. Then keep what you love and send back the rest. Experience our new app feature like Vision, an AI tool to see and shop new looks on you, and Stylist Connect, where you can directly chat with our real stylists. Plus, shipping and returns are on us. No subscriptions required. Your new personal style is just a few clicks away. Take the quiz now at stitchfix.com.
Oh my god, it has a... That's stupid. It has, like...
So then...
Okay, never mind.
This is all going to lead to the War of 1812. Jefferson is not president by this point, but he certainly is part of the road to it. Think of the Embargo Act of 1807, right? So, again, as we mentioned earlier during the Quasi-War, England and France pretty much constantly at war during this time period, and the U.S. is caught between them because we want to trade with both of them, and yet neither power wants us to trade with the other. And so the United States is going to say, hey, how about we just trade with both? France says, no, we will sink your ships. Or maybe just pay for your stuff and steal it and so you can't give it to the British. The British sink our ships and impress our sailors, aka make our sailors in their navy, and they don't like that. So then we begin complaining to both the British and the French, and we end up passing the Embargo Act that says no trade. Fine, no trade. Well, this ends up devastating New England merchants, and they hate Jefferson because of this. And then we're going to try some other things along the way, right? We're going to try like the Makin's Bill number 2. We're going to try the Non-Intercourse Act, all of those things.
What?
But eventually we're going to get involved in the War of 1812, where we fight against the British. They burn down the White House, and we attack Canada unsuccessfully. And then it ends up being a really big truce. Really the big losers of this whole thing involve Native Americans who are cut off from the British. They were on the side of the British during this time, but the British stop helping them, and the Americans and their greedy land hunger are going to take even more land from them after the War of 1812. After this, there is the so-called era of good feelings ? Because there are no Federalists that are a huge big deal. They still exist, of course, but they're largely off the screen by now. And there's the Democratic Republicans being the only political party around. But this doesn't mean that it's good feelings all around, because this is going to involve things like, well, what about the Missouri Compromise of 1820? More on that in a little bit, but like that shows the North and South divisions, and that's 1820 during this alleged era of good feelings. And so there are some divisions, for sure. During this time, the Supreme Court starts to flex its muscles, led by John Marshall, although they do not have their own building at this point. That's just the symbolic picture I chose because that's their building nowadays. There's going to be things like Marbury v. Madison, aka it establishes judicial review.
Hey!
Again, remember the whole like forest trees thing? You don't have to know all of these, and you don't have to memorize tons and tons of details about each of them. This is not AP Gov, although that is a fantastic class. Definitely know Marbury v. Madison establishes judicial review, aka the Supreme Court can decide if things are constitutional or not. There's Fletcher v. Peck. That establishes judicial review of state laws, which is somewhat important for the Supreme Court. McCulloch v. Maryland, it affirms the Supremacy Clause. It affirms loose constructionism, aka the federal government is above the state governments, And also the federal government has loose ideas, as in if it's implied in the Constitution, they can do it. It doesn't have to be explicitly listed there. And then Gibbons v. Ogden, this would be talking about how the federal government has the ability to regulate interstate commerce. So a bunch of these, all of which have to do with expanding the role of the federal government and allowing the federal government to get more involved. And that would make more sense. All right. Let's keep going then and talk about internal foreign policy. Wait a minute. That's weird, Lagerway. I thought you said foreign policy. And doesn't that mean overseas? Well, sometimes. Keep in mind, foreign policy just means interactions with other countries. And so we could talk about things that are internal to the United States eventually, like the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Talked about that already. Purchased from Napoleon. The Missouri Compromise of 1820. So notice here is the Louisiana Purchase. It goes up a little bit further right here. And it goes all the way here. So it doubles the size of the United States. The Missouri Compromise, well, Missouri wants to become a state. And the problem is it going to be a free or a slave state? If it's a slave state, it adds to the number of slave states in the Senate and thus gives them an advantage in the Senate. If it becomes a free state, it gives the free states an advantage in the Senate. And in order to appease the southern slaveholders who are threatening to secede and tear the country apart, they end up having this compromise, sometimes called the appeasement of 1820, since it's not really a compromise when one side threatens to leave and ruin the country unless they get their way. So the Missouri Compromise ends up being, okay, we'll have Maine as a free state, Missouri as a slave state, and then draw the line right here on the southern border of Missouri and say any state above that is free, any state below that can be slave, which only looks like these two. But keep in mind, at the time, Southerners were thinking there's going to be a lot more slave states, maybe coming out of Spanish territory that they were coveting, maybe out of Cuba, areas in the Caribbean. But, I mean, regardless, it's not like there's going to be a lot of slavery going on north of that line anyway, because there's not a lot of labor-intensive cash crop areas, right? All right, then we're going to have things like the Monroe Doctrine. That's where President James Monroe says, Europe, stay out of the Americas, no more colonization. And Europe goes, that's cute. Wait, I guess we'll do that anyway because we're kind of interested in keeping each other out. So there's a whole balance of power stuff. There's the Indian Removal Act, right? Trail of Tears under Andrew Jackson, where the 5 quote-unquote civilized tribes are removed from southeastern United States and moved into Oklahoma. Remember, some of these tribes were so civilized, like the Cherokee, they had a newspaper, they had written language, they were sedentary, they had agriculture, they even owned black slaves. Like, that's how like Americans they were. So, wow, it just turns out that there's really nothing that can stand in the way of this land-hungry greediness, which is not good.
We're learning about the laws of motion.
I saw a spaceship in the ocean.
So be aware of that. A couple examples of internal foreign policy. Using the word internal to mean in the present-day United States, but also engaging with Native Americans as well. All right. Well, speaking of the Missouri Compromise and problems, we have sectionalism in the early republic. And, ooh, this striking young man, this is going to be
ugly ass
Henry
bitch.
Clay. We'll talk about him because he is one of the guys involved in the American system. Henry Clay is a new leader in the Democratic Republican Party, eventually becoming leader of the faction known as the National Republicans, which will eventually become the Whig Party. We'll talk about Whigs in just a little bit.
Yeah, I need to remember that. I don't remember Whigs.
Tariffs are a tax on imported goods, and northern places are going to like this more because they manufacture the goods, and if there's a tax on imported goods, their goods are cheaper relative to the external foreign policy ones. But the southern colonies do not like tariffs because they have to import a lot more because they just grow cash crops or food, and they need to import all of their finished goods, so they do not like tariffs. Henry Clay's American system proposes to pay for things like canals, roads, and bridges and other internal improvements by using tariffs and the money those generate, and thus the Southerners and the Northerners are going to disagree on tariffs, they're going to disagree on the American system, and of course they're going to disagree on slavery. We have all sorts of examples during this time, right? The Missouri Compromise being one of them. Abolitionism continues to grow. African Americans in general. It's not like people up north weren't racist, right? Places like Illinois actually had laws on the books that said, we don't want any black people living here at all. And then the South is going to continue to expand slavery by moving into the so-called Black Belt, aka Alabama, Mississippi, all those areas with like really rich, dense black soil where it's really good to grow cotton, and they move a lot of enslaved people. If you're interested, check out Edward Baptiste's book, The Half Has Never Been Told, and it's all about the origins of American internal slave trade and how it grows during the 1800s. Horrific stories, but also incredible stories and ones that we need to know. And a lot of the internal slave trade ends up moving people in coffles from Virginia down to Alabama, Mississippi, etc. There are some rebellions we could talk about, like Nat Turner and the slave rebellions that happened in 1831. We got the Gabriel Prosser's rebellion in South Carolina in around 1800. And then there's the Market Revolution. The Market Revolution, which we'll get to in a little bit later in more detail, connects the Northeast to the Midwest, especially with things like the Erie Canal and railroads, etc. And so it's going to be much more connected to itself than the South is to the rest of the country. So thus leaving out the South, leading to, well, sectionalism, sectional tensions in the early republic. The next large figure we need to talk about, and again, let me just pause really quick. Period 4 is pretty messy. I like it. It's interesting, and it has a lot of really important stuff, but it's kind of messy. So we're dealing with this
Why is
a
it
little
not
more
like kind of
thematically,
Ronaldo?
thus to be able to talk about each theme in turn. We're not necessarily discussing it strictly chronologically, as chronologically as I can, but just be aware that some of these things overlap with each other. So this might not be a bad period to look at with a timeline, with some sort of chronological organizer, something like that might not be a bad idea. Well, one of the guys that Henry Clay squares off against is going to be Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson is going to be presiding over the Age of Jackson. Well, that makes sense, I guess. That begins in 1829 with his inauguration, after the election of 1828 that he wins, after the election of 1824 that he doesn't win. That's the corrupt bargain election, right? And Jackson, we need to know 5 things about him, and we'll use the acronym WHICH to remember which ones we need to know for him. So, here we go. First of all, war on the bank. Jackson did not like the National Bank. He thought it was unconstitutional. He thought it hurt small-time farmers and was just an excuse to move money around. So, therefore, war on bank. Indian removal. He's the president that presides over the Trail of Tears idea and starts to remove the Cherokee. T, the Tariff of Abominations. This is a time when there is a tariff that South Carolina does not like. Now, Jackson enforces the tariff even though he's a Democrat, and he says, look, it's all about union. South Carolina, you can't just leave whenever you don't feel like it or whenever you get whiny about a law you don't like. C, common man. This is the time period where democracy starts to change to be more inclusive. Keep in mind, actually, that democracy during the early 1800s, 1790s or so, became less inclusive. It used to be, right after the Revolution, some free black people, some women could vote, but all of that gets repealed in the 1790s, 1800s, 1810s. Yeah, the 1800s are sort of a mixed bag for democracy. Well, during this time, a lot of the property qualifications are repealed, so we have what's called universal white manhood suffrage, aka, if you are a white male, you may vote, and you don't have to necessarily own land. And then the H stands for hired friends, or the spoils system, aka
Say hello to Sara Lee Half Loaves. Half Loaf, right fit, realize great size, less waste, all taste, more flavors to savor. First bite right. Brand new, all you. Give a little Sara Lee love.
Okay, I can't even lie. That was
LinkedIn
kind
is
of
pretty great for discussing the latest ideas. We cannot stop your brother-in-law from discussing his ideas.
I call it the swimming desk. It's work up here and swim down there.
We can help you explore new roles. We cannot help if the patients still don't know the row closest in the back. Yikes. And while we can't stop what's growing in the office fridge, LinkedIn can help you grow in your career. LinkedIn is the network that works for you.
I'll reward my supporters by giving them jobs in the government. Okay. The second party system, which is happening around this time, gets really complicated, and if you look at this chart here, which comes from a fantastic political parties poster by David Walbert, it looks really confusing. But what you need to know is that there's the so-called era of good feelings here, and then Andrew Jackson, who turns into his own party, right? And so this is going to be the Democrats, know the Democrats. People against Jackson are going to be John Quincy Adams. They all sort of call themselves Democratic Republicans, but there's definitely the pro and anti-Jackson sections. And then the National Republicans, a.k.a. Henry Clay for a while, they'll eventually become the Whigs. National Republicans are kind of like proto or early Whigs. So we have options there. And then the Whigs will continue to exist for a while until they disintegrate after the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, but we'll talk about that later. Stop getting ahead of ourselves. I heard you ask those good questions, though. Nice job. So, your two big ones that you need to be familiar with are the Democrats and the Whigs. The Democrats, here's a nice chart. If you want to review this in a bit more detail, we're not going to cover all of this right now. But we should be aware that the Whigs generally support a more mixed economy and yet a lot of cultural sameness. Way to put that fancily is culturally homogenous and economically heterogeneous. But that gets too fancy, so shut up, Lagerway. The idea there is Democrats say, look, everybody should be a yeoman farmer, have their own small farm, and love slavery, and kind of more southern focused, although they're both national parties. But when it comes to culture, you can be an immigrant, you can have strange, different new ways, that's totally fine, we don't care. Whereas the Whigs say, you can be whatever occupation you want, banker, farmer, big city, small town, doesn't matter, but you really should be a Protestant, and you should act like it, and you should be a Protestant Christian kind of like we are. And so they're the ones, the Whigs, are going to be the ones where we get the antebellum reform movements, whereas the Democrats are going to be more supported by recent immigrants, because, they're letting the immigrants be themselves. So you have options there. More on that in a little bit with immigrants.
Should I pause
the market revolution?
Or would it be funnier if I actually beat
several
it?
Inventions that are important to know during period 8 that are going to change the way that the market
I think it'd be funnier if I beat it while
things like
playing
the steamship and the telegraph, as you can see right here. The cotton gin, though, is first. That's going to be in 1793. Makes cotton much more profitable. Leads to the expansion of slavery. There's the Erie Canal and other canals. Canals are going to help goods to move faster. The steam engine helps goods to move faster. Interchangeable parts help things get created faster and repaired faster. Are you seeing a theme here?
Funny.
Things get a lot faster.
This would be literally the funniest thing ever.
Helps information to move faster. And by the way, this isn't just like, LOL, I just bought a new sheep or something like that. This is also people moving faster and faster to say, hey, the price of grain just went up in New York City. Send your grain here, because if you get there first, you can sell at the high price. Ooh, good to know. As information travels faster, markets become more efficient. But at the same time, you're also going to have political parties become more efficient, right? So we have roads and telegraphs and Lowell Mills, McCormick Reapers, steel plow, all of those things. But the transportation and communication revolution, as it's sometimes called instead of the market revolution, that enables people to bring goods to market faster, sure, but also communicate faster. We would not have the second party system of broad universal white manhood suffrage unless everybody had access to newspapers. Think of things like the penny press and the continuous roll sheet that enable newspapers to be printed cheaply and quickly, and thus getting political information out to a bunch of informed citizens all over the country. One of the reasons we had the Electoral College in the first place, remember from the Constitution in 1787, is that mass-produced newspapers and mass voting even was not that common. So they thought, well, we don't want some uninformed person living in the middle of nowhere, New York, to vote for president. We'll have them vote for people they know they can trust, and those people will vote for president because they'll actually know the candidates. Well, by this point, it begins to change, although the Electoral College doesn't change, and of course that's still around to this day. So how does the market revolution change society? Well, first of all, we have, as you can see in that picture, that I actually took myself on a trip down south, King Cotton. Cotton is going to be incredibly important. It ties North and South together.
You know how fun it would be to just travel the world and
say, well, the North was super free from racism and slavery, but whereas down South they had all this slavery and they were all racist. Everybody was complicit in the slave trade, right? King Cotton is profitable down south because of the growing of cotton, but then where does it go to be made into cloth? Oh, that's right, the Lowell Mills and the Slater Mills up north. They then sell it to the south. Besides, the North also is going to sell things like slave insurance. I kid you not, slave insurance. Insurance on enslaved people. That's how they're considered
slave
property,
insurance?
Right?
That sounds like
And the North
horrible.
is also going to sell... I have a lot of banks, so they're going to provide a lot of capital to build new
Like, how you about to give like?
As a nurse, you give 100%.
No way.
At Post University, our 100% on.
I'm not letting no
new
freaking
farms,
ad,
which are
bro.
gonna
Come
employ
on.
A lot of enslaved people. A lot of immigrants are coming because of the jobs. Think the Irish and the German. They are going to be pulled here, pushed because of the Irish potato famine, instability in Germany, pulled here by the first wave of industrialization and thus new jobs, particularly in northern cities. They're not so interested in moving down south because, of course, down south, they can't compete with enslaved labor. But immigrants coming are going to lead to, of course, a backlash, aka the Know Nothing American Party, which is nativist, and the Know Nothing ticket, so-called because they're supposed to be a secret organization. So if someone says, "Are you part of the American Party?" you say, "I know nothing about that." Yeah, it
That's
turns out if
low-key
you have to
kinda
hide
smart,
it, it's
though.
probably a bad thing. And the Know Nothings are xenophobic and racist, and they don't like the Germans or the Irish. They only like native-born Americans, aka Americans who got here before me. So then I like them. Urbanization continues during this time. People are moving to more and more cities, as a lot of the factory jobs are in these cities. There's new roles for women, as many of them work in places like the Lowell Mills. They're going to work in factories, and thus they're going to have some of their own independence, their own spending. And then there, at the same time, is going to be this thing called the cult of domesticity, aka the ideal is going to be, I am so rich that my wife does not have to work outside the home. Working outside the home is something that you have to do in bad times or if the husband gets unemployed. But the cult of domesticity puts women on a pedestal and says women
Okay,
are
for the
fragile,
sake of
should
like
not be
how beautiful this song is at this part, I'm blasting this as loud as I can. I don't know. I turned my volume mixer down. This is a horrible time to pause. I'm like tweaking out a little bit. I'm just gonna. Bro, if I die at this part, I'm gonna cry. I'm gonna kill myself. Come on, baby! God, please! I swear to God! Holy shit, I'm gonna be so fucking mad. Woo! Yes! Ah! Yes! Let's go! Oh my fucking God! Let's fucking go, yo! Holy shit! Holy fucking shit!
Trouble, can you just slam the fuck out of your desk? I want to see how your mic picks it up.
Okay. I don't think my mom would mind.